Rio wakes up and finds himself in a realm of clouds with an angel standing in front of him. First of all, the angel informs him that he recently died, but he also says that Rio won't be going to the afterlife. Long story short, that damn truck got another one, so now Michael has to send Rio to another world so he can start a new life. From the information Michael has, Rio isn't going to receive any special mission or task to accomplish in the new world, so he is free to do whatever he wants. Rio says he would like to live a slow and relaxing life, and Michael is fine with that, but first he needs to give Rio a basic rundown of the world he will be reincarnating into. It is a magical world called Phi, and roughly 20% of the population can cast spells with their natural elements. With that said, the element Rio is most compatible with is water, and since he requested a slow, relaxing life, Michael took the liberty of setting up a small house with a starter pack and a barrier around it to keep monsters away. As a part of his starter pack, Michael has also prepared an ice house with 2 months worth of food in storage, so Rio won't have to worry about going hungry for a while. He also bought a book with detailed descriptions of all the monsters Rio might encounter in the area. This is going to be helpful when Rio eventually encounters the beasts of the forest, but for now, he wants to try out his new magic. He heads outside and yells out the incantation water ball, causing a sphere of water to appear in his hand, so magic seems a lot easier than he expected it to be. But he can also do it by just thinking of a water ball, so the incantation isn't really necessary. Now that he knows he can use magic, he heads straight for the bathhouse and starts filling the tub with water, but he soon realizes that he only knows how to make warm water. There's no way he can enjoy a bath that isn't hot, so he heads outside and immediately starts working on a fire to heat up the water. But unfortunately, he has no idea how to start a fire like this. He eventually gives up and lays down on his back, but then he looks up at the sun, and it gives him a good idea. Rio grabs a basin and fills it with water, then he tries focusing on it to compress the water while removing the heat. Eventually, ice begins to form, and after a little more practice, he is able to shake the ice into a magnifying glass so he can use the sun to start a fire. He then uses that fire to heat up a nice bath, so by the end of day 1, he can finally relax. With what he learned from creating the ice, he should be able to create hot water on his own if he just adds heat to the water instead, so he will have to start practicing that soon. The next morning, Rio is having breakfast when he starts thinking about his future. Michael only gave him 2 months worth of food, so he's going to have to go hunting eventually to replenish his stock. However, he's pretty sure a single knife won't be enough to handle the monsters out in the forest, so he decides to start training his offensive magic. The first thing he does is try shooting a water ball at a tree, and it works just as he had expected it to, but a little ball of water probably isn't going to be very helpful in combat. However, he knows of a way to make the water's impact stronger, so he forms another water ball, but this time, he concentrates all the water into a single point for extra pressure. It's a great idea in theory, but he still isn't skilled enough to put much force behind it, so his water jet is the equivalent of a squirt gun right now. Rio thinks back to something Michael told him before he reincarnated. Magic is all about imagination, so he needs to have a clear picture of what he's trying and continue working towards it until he gets better. After a few days of constant practice, Rio's water jets are starting to look decent, but it's still nowhere near strong enough to kill a monster yet. Additionally, Rio has also managed to get the hang of creating hot water, so he can now make warm baths for himself when he wants, although he still needs to work on temperature control. The next morning, he wants to start working on his ice magic again, so he heads out and tries creating ice out of thin air this time. It takes a lot of effort, but he is eventually able to summon ice from nothing, even if it took 3 to 4 business days for it to form, and he isn't able to shoot it as easily as water. So far, combat training hasn't been going very well since none of the spells he came up with have been effective, but over the next few hours, Rio keeps practicing as much as he can until he eventually collapses to the floor from mana exhaustion. He decides to call it a day for now, but the next morning, as soon as his mana has recovered, he begins practicing again. This becomes Rio's daily routine for the next few weeks, and after all his training, he is now able to form ice instantly, so it is a viable attack now. With his new arsenal of attack spells finally complete and his food supply running low, Rio heads out into the forest for the first time to begin his hunt. He immediately spots a pair of animal footprints, so he follows them until he eventually arrives at a nearby river. While he's there, he manages to find some flint by the riverside, and he can use it to start fires by striking it against the edge of his sword. While he's here, he also plans to gather some detoxification herbs in case he ever needs them, and all of a sudden, he hears a low-pitched growling sound coming from behind him. When he turns around, he finds a lesser boar staring him down, and he is completely frozen. The boar starts charging at Rio, but this is the first time he has ever had to fight for his life, so he's having trouble thinking of what to do. Just as the boar is about to hit him, he manages to snap out of it and jumps to the side to avoid getting trampled. But it doesn't look like the boar is done with him yet. Fortunately, Rio has finally regained his composure, so as the boar is running at him, he creates an ice track to make it slip, and then he forms several ice spikes right in the path of the boar, leading to its immediate and brutal death. After processing the boar meat, Rio takes a look at the monster book to read about it, and apparently the lesser boar is the weakest monster you can encounter in that forest. The whole book is meant to be a guide for beginners, so most of the monsters in it are pretty basic, but there are 2 extra pages at the end of the book which seem important. One page talks about dragons and how they are creatures powerful enough to destroy entire cities on their own. The book recommends running away immediately if he ever encounters one because he'd stand no chance of defeating it, although he probably wouldn't be able to outrun it either, so he'd be better off begging for mercy. There's also a page here talking about something called a demon, but there's not a lot of information on it, so all the book says is that if you ever run into one, you're doomed. The next day, Rio goes out hunting again, but while he wasn't paying attention, he is suddenly attacked from above by a giant assassin hawk. The hawk is able to use wind magic to slash through its prey, so Rio is forced to run while creating ice shields to block the razor wind. He knows how tough hawks are to deal with, so he would rather not fight it, but there's no way he will be able to outrun it, so his only option right now is to fight back. He raises his hand and begins casting his water jets, but the hawk manages to dodge his attack and swoops down with wind magic to strike Rio. However, Rio reacts in time to create an ice shield, slashing the hawk across the eye and causing it to slam headfirst into the ground. A few moments later, the hawk regains consciousness, although its eye has been permanently damaged, so it flies into the air to retreat. But before it leaves, it takes one final look at Rio to memorize his face, because now the hawk has a personal beef with him. Rio is relieved that he managed to survive, but this really isn't what he was expecting his new relaxing life to become. While Rio was being chased by the hawk, he ran so far that he ended up getting lost in the forest until late into the night, and while he was trying to find his way back home, he happens to come across a glowing lake with a Dullahan standing in the middle, and it looks like it has spotted him. As time goes on, Rio continues his training, and now he is able to hunt and preserve food for himself with relative ease. His water magic has also gotten a lot stronger, allowing him to create sharp ice sheets and bring them down with great force in an instant. His water jet has also become strong enough to cut through solid rock with ease, so his combatability is pretty good now. But ice magic isn't the only training he has been doing lately. Ever since that day he was spotted by the Dullahan, he has gone out into the forest late every night to fight it. Headless horsemen weren't mentioned in the monster guidebook at all, so it is either not a monster or it's simply too advanced for the beginner guidebook. Either way, Rio still plans to fight it, so he charges forward with his ice stick and begins swinging. This is more of a training session than an actual fight because the Dullahan outclasses Rio in both strength and skill, but Rio is still doing his best to block the Dullahan's attacks with his ice shields, but he still ends up getting taken down in a matter of seconds. The Dullahan has never said a word to Rio, but for some reason, Rio feels like he has taken on the role of a teacher trying to whip him into shape. Just then, the Dullahan raises its sword and uses water magic to extend its blade. Rio is surprised to learn that the Dullahan can use water magic as well, but after demonstrating how the sword works, it hands it over to Rio and walks out onto the lake. Sometime later, Rio was out hunting as usual when he was suddenly attacked by the same assassin hawk from last time. He doesn't recall it being black last time he saw it, so he assumes it must have worked hard to evolve just so it could come back for a rematch. The hawk dives toward Rio and launches several wind slashes, so Rio puts up 5 layers of ice walls to protect himself. However, since it has evolved, a hawk's wind slashes are so strong that they instantly shattered all of Rio's ice walls. And now he's starting to get really nervous. He starts darting across the field while putting up ice walls to block any incoming attacks, and when he finally sees an opening, he counterattacks by launching several ice spikes. However, the hawk managed to dodge the spikes with a sudden burst of speed, and that's not all either. It opens its mouth and screeches at a frequency that interferes with Rio's magic, so all of his ice shields disappear, and he is practically defenseless. But the hawk still isn't done yet, so it begins hovering in front of Rio, and he can tell that something big is coming, but he doesn't know when it is. Moments later, Rio can feel electricity in the air as a bolt of lightning is shot straight at him, and an attack like that would have been fatal, but luckily he was able to use his stick as a lightning rod and jump away to save himself. While Rio is recovering from the partial shock he just received, the hawk comes down and tries to finish him off with its talons, but at the last second, Rio pulls out his ice sword and parries the attack. The hawk clashes with him a few more times, but thanks to all Rio's training with Dullahan, he is able to quickly locate a gap in the hawk's defenses and stab it through the neck. After the hawk falls to the ground, Rio approaches it because he can understand how it feels. It lost an eye because of Rio, so it desperately wanted to prove that it was stronger than him, which is why it evolved in the first place. But Rio has also spent his time trying to get strong, so in the end, the Hawks still lost. After that, Rio begins walking home, but to his utter shock, he is suddenly confronted by a dragon. He remembers what the book said about dragons being unstoppable, so he believes he is doomed, but to his surprise, the dragon begins talking to him using telepathy. The dragon doesn't seem like it wants to hurt Rio in any way. In fact, it just stuck here because it is currently looking for a black hawk that came this way, so it was wondering if Rio might have seen it around here. Rio is glad that the dragon isn't hostile, but it is probably talking about the hawk he just killed, so he apologizes profusely and explains that the hawk attacked him, so he had no choice but to kill it. The dragon is surprised to hear that a human like Rio could kill a hawk, but he doesn't seem too upset about it. On another note, the dragon is rather intrigued by the sword Rio is carrying because he recognizes it as the Fairy King's. And for him to have given it away to a young boy, Rio must have done something to get on his good side. The dragon has taken a liking to Rio, and Rio has a few questions he was hoping to ask since he still doesn't have much information about this world. He and the dragon end up talking for a few hours until it is late into the evening, but their conversation is cut short because the dragon needs to return home now. Rio thanks him for answering his questions, and the dragon thanks him as well because it has been ages since he got to have such an interesting conversation. The two of them say their goodbyes, but while that is happening, Michael is up in heaven reviewing the paperwork for Rio's reincarnation when he notices something he missed earlier. It looks like Rio was given the hidden trait of eternal youth for some reason, and Michael thinks it's strange because he hasn't seen someone with a hidden trait since he sent a hero girl to Fae 10,000 years ago. One day, Rio heads down to the beach because he has been craving salt recently. But when he gets there, he finds the wreckage of a washed-up ship. He approaches the ship to see if there are any survivors, and he finds a body lying next to it, but when he checks on the guy, he realizes the man is already dead, so there's nothing he can do to help. However, just then, Rio hears the sound of someone grunting on the other side of the beach, so he looks over there, and he is pleased to see that someone actually survived the wreckage. The ship was destroyed by a giant sea monster during a massive storm, so Abel was certain he would meet his end at sea, but to his surprise, he wakes up in a warm bed. All of his stuff has been set aside on the table next to him, so he grabs it and starts exploring the area because he has no idea where he is. He heads outside in hopes of spotting a landmark or something, but all he can see around the house is a thick tree line. Just then, Rio comes out of the house and he says he's glad to see that Abel is back on his feet. Abel is shocked when he realizes Rio is here because he couldn't sense him approaching him at all, but aside from that, he thinks Rio is dressed really weird. He's about to ask why Rio has no sense of style, but then he realizes that it would be rude to say something like that right off the bat, so instead, he first thanks Rio for saving his life. Rio says there's no need to thank him since all he did was carry Abel's body here. But unfortunately, Abel was the only one left alive by the time Rio found them, so the rest of the people aboard the ship are long dead. Abel is a bit surprised that other people washed up alongside him, but he tells Rio that he doesn't have time to worry about their deaths too much because everyone else on that ship was an illegal smuggler. Rio isn't exactly sure what Abel means by smugglers, but for now, Abel must be pretty hungry after surviving a wreck like that, so Rio offers to make some lunch for him. While they are eating, Abel eventually asks Rio why he's wearing nothing but a loincloth, so Rio explains that he doesn't have any clothes to wear. Abel asks why Rio doesn't just go out and buy some clothes, but then he stops himself because he thinks Rio may not have enough money to buy necessities for himself, and it would be rude to bring that up now. Rio is indeed broke AF right now, but even if he had money to spend, he wouldn't be able to buy anything because there are no towns or villages anywhere near his house. Abel is shocked to hear that, but for someone living out here on their own, Abel is impressed by how well Rio is doing for himself. He asked Rio if he used that knife on the table to hunt for the meat they are eating right now, but Rio says the knife is mainly for butchering his catches. When he goes out hunting, he usually just uses his water magic, and as proof of his ability, he creates a little water to fill a jug. Abel is amazed because even on the Central Plains, only about half of the people there can use magic. Rio, on the other hand, is shocked to learn that magic is so common since Michael told him that only 20% of the population can wield magic. After lunch, Abel asks Rio to lead him back to the shipwreck because there's something there that he needs to check. Rio agrees to lead Abel back to the coast, and while the two of them are walking, Abel asks Rio why he doesn't use a magic staff even though he's a magician. Rio is a little confused since he has never needed a staff, but Abel then realizes that if Rio can't buy clothes, then of course he wouldn't be able to buy a staff either. To make up for his rudeness, Abel asks Rio to let him handle all the fighting if they run into any trouble along the way. Rio tries telling him that that won't be necessary since he can already handle all the threats in the forest on his own, but Abel insists since he wants to contribute somehow. The two of them eventually arrive at the wreckage, but to Rio's surprise, all the bodies have disappeared. He thinks a monster must have shown up and eaten the bodies at some point, so Abel was really lucky that Rio found him before anything bad had happened. After searching the wreckage for a while, Abel realizes that what he's looking for isn't here, so he stops looking. Rio asks him what he plans to do now, so Abel says he's going to regroup with his friends, although that's a lot easier said than done. Heading to the town of Loon would be a good start towards getting him back to his friends, but he's pretty sure that this place is way down south of Loon, and he has no idea how long it will take for him to get back. He fears he may have to brace himself for a long and lonely journey, but then he comes up with an idea and asks Rio if he'd like to come with him. Rio is a little stunned by the offer, but Abel says he's not familiar with this area at all, so he can really use a guide to help lead him back. Rio thinks about it for a second, and there really isn't much reason for him to stay here at this point. He's also curious to learn about what the other people of this world are like, so he agrees to accompany Abel. However, he has a few things he needs to take care of first, so he asks if it's okay for them to leave tomorrow morning. Abel has no objections, so they head back to Rio's house for now, and later that night, Rio prepares to head out into the forest alone. Abel thinks it's odd that Rio would want to go out to see someone at this time of night, especially since he said there were no other people in this area, but he also doesn't want to pry into Rio's personal business too much, so he doesn't say anything. Rio heads into the forest and eventually meets with Dullahan. He informs them that he will be leaving the forest for some time, and this may be the last time they get to spar together for a while, so he plans to fight as hard as he can. Rio readies his sword and charges at Dullahan, and Dullahan is still able to block all of Rio's attacks, but with how much Rio has improved, his attacks are strong enough to actually push Dullahan back for a change. However, Dullahan's skill is still far greater than that of Rio's, so after a long battle, Rio falls to his knees in defeat. Now that their match is over, Dullahan slowly starts walking back out onto the lake, so Rio gets up and thanks it for all the training it has given him. It's all thanks to Dullahan's help that Rio has been able to survive in this forest for so long, and Dullahan has come to think of Rio as his precious student, so as a parting gift, it presents Rio with a special robe, and Rio is really grateful. The next morning, Rio and Abel are finally ready to leave on their journey, and as they walk away, Rio says one final goodbye to his first home in this world. As the two make their way deeper into the forest, they soon encounter a boar monster, so Abel asks Rio to stand back and let him handle it. He draws his sword and charges at the boar while calling out a combat skill called Total Impalement, and in an instant, a hole is blown clean through the boar's body. Rio is amazed by what he just saw, so he asks Abel what combat skills are, and Abel explains that those who can't use magic fight with techniques called combat skills, which allow them to do incredible things like what Abel just did to that boar. After a day of walking through the forest, they eventually arrive at a marsh area, but it's full of lizardmen and Abel would like to avoid fighting them all together, so he suggests that he and Rio should circle around through the woods. However, while they are taking the detour, Rio senses something slowly creeping up on them, so he has Abel's attention and informs him that the lizardmen are following them. Abel says they are going to have to fight them off, so he readies his sword, but Rio tells him there are too many lizardmen for Abel to fight on his own, so he's going to deal with them using magic. Abel doesn't understand how Rio intends to defeat a group of lizardmen on his own, but as the lizards emerge from the tree line, Rio immediately shoots them down with several icicles. Abel is shocked by what he just witnessed, but they are still in the middle of a battle, so he's going to have to save his questions for later. Once all the lizardmen have been dealt with, Abel asks Rio to explain what kind of spell he just used. Rio doesn't understand what Abel is talking about since all he did was cast several ordinary icicle spells, but from what Abel has been told, a mage should only be able to cast one spell at a time. Abel got the information from a wind mage, so Rio thinks the limit of one spell at a time must be unique to wind magic because he has never had any trouble multicasting with water before. Anyway, before they continue, Rio creates a glass of water for Abel since they need to stay hydrated, but Abel notices that the incantation Rio used this time is different from the one he used to create water before, so he's curious. Rio doesn't actually need to use incantations at all, he just thinks they sound really cool, but he doesn't want Abel to think he's weird, so he pretends nothing changed. They eventually make it out of the forest and into an open field, but without realizing it, they had accidentally wandered into a rock golem field, so Abel and Rio have to block the rocks being thrown at them. This is the first time Rio has ever seen rock golems, and he is surprised because they look nothing like what he had expected. Abel runs ahead and tries using his Total Impalement skill on the golems, but even though he managed to carve a hole through one of them, the golem seals itself back up in an instant, so he won't be able to make much progress like this. Since the golems are able to heal, Rio thinks they need to destroy them in one attack, and he has the perfect spell in mind for the job. He asks Abel to give him some space because he has something he wants to try, and once Abel is out of the danger zone, Rio uses his magic to summon an ice cube, a really big one. He then drops the cube on two of the golems, and even he is a little scared by how destructive that attack was. He does the same thing to the rest of the golems until there's only one left, but this one isn't moving anymore for some reason. Rio assumes the golems must have been absorbing energy from the ground to power their attacks, so now that this one has fallen over, it can't do much anymore. They also spot a massive magic stone at the bottom of the golem, so they plan to take it with them, but it's too bad that they can't get any more since all the other golems were crushed. The two of them set up camp for the night, and while they are talking, Abel mentions something about dungeons having monsters like golems. As soon as Rio hears the word dungeon, he becomes incredibly excited and asks why Abel didn't mention anything about dungeons earlier. Abel didn't think Rio would be so interested in the topic, but if he really wants to see a dungeon so badly, then he's in luck, because the only dungeon in the Central Plains is located in Lune, the town they are headed for. Rio asks if there's anything else he should know about, so Abel asks if he knows about the dwarves and elves. Rio has heard a little about them, but he wants some more details, so Abel explains that dwarves are strong, short people who are good with crafts, and there are quite a few of them in Lune. But as for elves, most of them live in wooded areas and don't interact with humans often, so Abel only knows of one elf in Lune. The next morning, the two continue heading north, and Rio says that once they make it past those mountains over there, they will find human civilization. Abel has been trying avoiding prying too much into Rio's personal matters, but he's really curious as to how on earth Rio knows where he's going when he has never actually been to a human village. The truth is, Rio got all this info from his conversation with the dragon, but he's pretty sure saying that would freak Abel out, so he tells him he's better off not knowing. A few moments later, Rio senses something terrifying nearby, and to both his and Abel's horror, they are confronted by a giant griffin. Neither of them has what it takes to defeat a monster like this, so Rio thinks quickly and reaches into his pouch, throwing the meat he saved for later into the air. Abel does the same, and the griffin immediately snatches it out of the air. It now has enough food for the day, so it decides to leave the two of them alone, and they are both incredibly relieved that they managed to survive. Abel says monsters like griffins haven't been seen near humans for centuries, so it is likely that this mountain is keeping a lot of the more powerful monsters away from civilization. But if that's the case, then they are bound to run into even more monsters here. And it looks like he was right, because not long after, they both encounter a group of wyverns. Abel thinks they should circle around to avoid fighting them, but that would take way too long on a mountain, and besides, while the griffin may have been too much for Rio to handle, he knows he's strong enough to beat the wyverns. So he runs out from cover and uses several icicle spears to bring the wyverns down. Abel is astonished by how easy that was, since wyverns usually require 20 adventurers to defeat, but as long as they made it out in one piece, he's not complaining. Rio and Abel continue fighting their way through the mountain after that, and eventually, they manage to make it to the other side, so they are one step closer to making it back to civilization. This was the end of episode 2. Subscribe to not miss the next part.